Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. I always considered myself a reasonable man. Someone who tried to see the best in people, to avoid drama, and stay focused on the life I was building. But over time, those qualities became my blind spots. My wife, Lucy, exploited that about me. Lucy and I met over a decade ago, and in the beginning, I was captivated by her. She had a magnetic energy, light-hearted, quick to laugh, and a beauty that turned heads everywhere we went. She was spontaneous in ways I was not, and I admired her for it. I thought she brought balance to my life. I spent years making sacrifices, ensuring her happiness, even helping her through a career change that shook our finances. I saw myself as her support system, her partner through thick and thin. In return, I thought she respected our bond, our life together. That's what made everything unravel in such an ugly way when things started to feel off. It wasn't any one event that signaled something was wrong. It was the subtle changes, the small cracks that didn't quite line up with the Lucy I thought I knew. She started spending more time on her phone, and if I entered a room, she'd tuck it out of sight with a quick, nervous smile. She suddenly became interested in weekend girl trips, something she hadn't shown a desire for in years. I wanted to trust her. Each time she left, she'd throw in a few affectionate words, a smile, a kiss, and leave me with nothing but the smell of her perfume lingering in the hallway. It worked at first. But her act began to unravel. On one of her weekends away, I received a text meant for someone else. A short, simple message that read, "Can't wait to be alone with you." It was from her, but she thought she'd sent it to Kyle, her friend from the gym. My stomach turned as I read it, and a wave of nausea washed over me. In a single sentence, she'd torn the fabric of our life together. My hand shook as I held the phone, staring at that damned message. How could she be so careless? I considered confronting her the moment she returned, but a bigger part of me wanted to be sure. So I waited. I watched her more closely after that weekend. I started picking up on the signals I had dismissed for so long. Her eagerness to leave the house at odd hours, her reluctance to let me touch her phone, and her sudden obsession with fitness, all signs I should have seen but didn't want to acknowledge. I forced myself to look straight at it now. One night, after she left her phone on the kitchen counter and hurried upstairs to grab a sweater, I picked it up, my heart pounding. Her lock screen lit up with a notification from none other than Kyle, "Looking forward to tonight. Don't make me wait too long, winky face." My heart raced, but I kept my face neutral when she returned to the kitchen. Her eyes darted to the phone in my hand, and for a split second, a shadow of worry crossed her face. But she covered it quickly, flashing me a smile as if everything was fine. She reached for her phone and tucked it in her purse, looking at me with that polished, unbreakable charm that was now grating. That was when I knew. I didn't need her to admit it, and I didn't need her to lie to my face again. The woman I had married, the woman I had supported and loved, had been lying to me for months, maybe even years. But I wouldn't blow up her world with a single accusation. No, if she thought she could play me for a fool, I'd give her a taste of her own game. I began planning a weekend getaway for us. I was smart about it, slipping the idea into a casual conversation one night as we sat across from each other at the dinner table. She seemed suspicious, but when I mentioned how busy I'd been at work and how much I missed her, she softened. A hint of guilt flashed in her eyes, and she agreed to go, brushing it off as a nice change of pace for both of us. As the weekend approached, I made every arrangement carefully. I booked a cabin tucked away in the woods, deep enough for privacy but close enough that we could reach it without hassle. The perfect setting to finally bring everything out into the open, to let her think she was safe, that everything was normal. I packed my bag that Friday, watching as she prepared with a mix of excitement and nerves. She threw a few outfits into a bag, her favorite bottle of wine, even a romance novel she hadn't read in years. She put in just enough effort to make it seem like she wanted to be there with me. That much was clear. But the guilt in her eyes had grown sharper. I could tell that she knew the game was almost up, though I doubted she had any idea just how far I'd go to take control back. We drove in silence most of the way to the cabin, the tension simmering between us like a dark cloud. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, studying her expressions. She had grown more distant, reserved. When we arrived, she exhaled a little, visibly relaxing in the isolated setting. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, a far cry from the hotels and resorts she'd been staying at with her so-called friends. That evening, after we settled in, I poured us each a glass of wine. She seemed on edge, but I kept my tone light, leaning back in my chair across from her by the fire. We made small talk, but her mind was elsewhere. Every so often, she would glance at her phone, as if waiting for some message or notification. My stomach clenched, but I kept my face calm, almost detached. As we talked, I steered the conversation to more personal territory, asking her how she felt about our marriage, about our future. She paused, seemingly caught off guard by the intimacy of the question. She forced a laugh, saying something about the little ruts of routine and how she missed the excitement of new things. She was trying to mask her guilt with charm, and for the first time, it had no effect on me. Finally, I asked her the question I'd been holding on to since the moment she agreed to come with me. "Lucy, are you happy?" Her eyes widened, and she hesitated, glancing away. It took her a moment to answer, and when she did, it was with a thin, faltering smile. "Of course," she said, her voice light, "just, sometimes life feels a bit stifling. But that's normal, right?" I nodded, my eyes holding hers, letting her feel the weight of the silence between us. But I didn't press her any further. Not yet. After that conversation by the fire, I let Lucy feel the tension thickening, almost palpable, hanging between us. But I kept things as normal as possible. I didn't want to scare her off from any admissions, and I certainly didn't want to end the game early. I could tell she was uneasy but comforted by the cozy environment, probably relieved that I hadn't pushed too far or raised my voice. I gave her a calm, undisturbed exterior. Maybe that was why she wasn't picking up on the cold truth settling beneath my questions. The next morning, I made us breakfast, eggs, toast, a few slices of fruit. Simple but thoughtful. She seemed to relax again, leaning into my gestures, perhaps clinging to the familiarity of our shared routine. But I could see the subtle glances she gave me, almost as if she was trying to assess how much I knew, trying to calculate whether I was aware of her secret life. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk down the trail that looped through the woods. She looked hesitant but agreed, and we set out together. The morning was cool, and the trees were dense enough that only soft streaks of sunlight reached us. We walked in silence, my hands in my pockets, while she kept her arms wrapped around herself. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. She was already squirming under the quiet, uneasy with the unspoken tension she couldn't fully understand. At one point, as we reached a clearing, I stopped and looked around, feeling the chill in the air. Lucy, I started slowly, I've been thinking a lot about us lately." She looked up, startled, and gave me a nervous smile. "Oh. What about?" "I don't know. Just, things. Trust, for example." I watched her closely. Her gaze faltered, darting away as she tried to look at anything other than me. "I think trust is important, don't you?" I pressed, not taking my eyes off her. "Of course," she replied, too quickly, her voice tense. She forced a laugh that sounded almost painful. "Why would you ask me that?" "Just seems like a good thing to discuss, right?" I said, as calmly as if we were talking about the weather. I could see her start to pale. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, glancing back toward the trail as though she wanted to head back. But I stayed where I was, letting her stew in the silence. I continued, as if musing to myself, how could any relationship survive without trust? I paused, then asked, "Have you always felt that you could trust me, Lucy?" She didn't answer right away. Her face was pale now, her fingers twisting nervously. "Of course, Mark," she finally whispered, barely looking at me. "I mean, I wouldn't have married you if I didn't." I let that statement hang in the air, watching as her discomfort grew. I could tell she wanted to change the subject, but I was in no mood to let her off the hook. Not yet. I could almost feel her wanting to make excuses, to pull out her phone or look away, anything to escape. But I wasn't giving her an inch. I turned away, starting back down the trail without a word. After a few moments, I heard her footsteps as she hurried to catch up, walking beside me but keeping a careful distance. The rest of the walk was a strained silence, her eyes never meeting mine, her gaze fixed on the ground as though it held the answers she was desperate to find. When we got back to the cabin, I grabbed my bag and pulled out a notebook and pen, sitting down at the kitchen table. I didn't look up, didn't say a word. I could feel her watching me, her expression a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "What's that for?" she finally asked, her voice shaky. "Just some thoughts I've been jotting down," I said casually, opening the notebook. I flipped through a few blank pages, letting her wonder what I was thinking, what I might be writing down. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as I wrote random lines and symbols, letting her imagination fill in the gaps. The discomfort was eating away at her, and I savored every second. Finally, she turned and disappeared into the bedroom, likely to escape my silent scrutiny. Later, as we sat together for lunch, I could feel her pulling herself together, trying to regain control of her composure. She was fidgeting, looking anywhere but directly at me. Her calm facade was cracking, but she tried her best to hold it up. "Mark," she finally began, her tone forced and overly casual, I was thinking maybe we could have a nice evening in. I could cook us dinner, maybe open that wine I brought." I smiled, watching her scramble to hold on to her image of a loving, committed wife. I nodded, saying, "Sounds like a great idea." I could tell she was relieved, thinking she had diffused the tension. While she prepared dinner that night, I took a glass of whiskey and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. My mind raced, replaying the moments in our marriage I'd once cherished but now saw as hollow memories. Her laughter, the touch of her hand, her whispered promises of forever, they all felt like lies now. Maybe they had been from the start. I heard her moving around in the kitchen, humming softly, and it struck me how well she could play the part of a loving wife. But I wasn't falling for it anymore. When she brought out dinner, I thanked her, keeping my tone light and calm. She poured the wine, and we toasted to us, a bitter irony that only I could appreciate. I watched her drink, her eyes flickering to me every so often, as if she was trying to gauge my mood. After we'd finished eating, I cleared my throat and said, "Lucy, can I ask you something?" She looked up, her eyes widening just a little, but she nodded. "What was it that first drew you to me?" I asked, my voice soft, almost tender. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Well, you're kind. Generous. And, dependable." She smiled, a small, wavering smile that seemed to lack conviction. I could tell she was treading carefully, unsure of where I was going with this. "Dependable," I repeated, nodding slowly. "Yeah. I guess I am, aren't I?" She looked uneasy, shifting in her seat. "Why are you asking me this, Mark?" "Just curious." I took another sip of wine, leaning back in my chair. "It's funny, you know. All these years, I thought we had this solid foundation. I thought we understood each other." I let my words linger, my tone casual, but I could see her hands tightening around her wine glass. She swallowed hard. "We do, Mark. We understand each other." I nodded, pretending to accept that answer, though I could see the lie in her eyes. She was grasping at straws, desperate to hold on to her facade. I was watching her squirm, and it brought a cold satisfaction I hadn't known I was capable of. Finally, I set my glass down and looked her in the eye. "Lucy," I said quietly, "have you ever lied to me?" Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. What? No. Why would you ask me that?" I leaned forward, my gaze piercing through her. "Because I need to know. I need you to tell me the truth, Lucy. Once and for all." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I could see the panic in her eyes, the silent struggle as she fought to come up with something to say. And for the first time in a long time, she seemed genuinely vulnerable, stripped of her practiced charm. After a long pause, she finally whispered, I don't know what you're talking about." I held her gaze, unblinking. "Are you sure?" Her eyes welled with tears, and she looked away, her shoulders sagging. She was on the edge, teetering on the brink of a confession. But I wasn't about to let her off that easy. Not yet. I wanted her to feel every ounce of guilt, every drop of shame. She bit her lip, her hands shaking as she set her glass down. "Mark," she finally choked out, I think you're tired. Maybe we should get some rest." I let her retreat. Let her think she'd escaped. But deep down, I knew that it wouldn't be long before she cracked. The guilt was clawing at her, tearing away at her resolve. And I was there, watching, waiting, ready to make her face the truth she tried so hard to hide. The next morning, Lucy was quiet, and the shadows under her eyes hinted at a restless night. She moved around the cabin with a kind of robotic precision, avoiding my gaze. There was no more pretense, no more cheerful hum as she made breakfast. Instead, there was a tightness to her every movement, as if she were wound up, barely holding herself together. I sat at the table, sipping my coffee, watching her pour herself a cup. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it to her lips. She must have noticed me watching her because she took a deep breath, put on a strained smile, and muttered a quiet, "Good morning," without looking at me. I nodded in response, and we sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of our cups and the occasional rustle of the trees outside. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She blinked, then nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yeah, of course," she said, her voice just a little too bright. "Just didn't sleep well." It was a small lie, one that I wouldn't have questioned before. But now, every word she said felt loaded, layered with unspoken meanings. She was unraveling, and I didn't need to push her too hard. She was doing it to herself, piece by piece. "Lucy," I said, breaking the silence, "let's go for another walk. Fresh air might do us both some good." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with a trace of panic before she composed herself and nodded. She knew she couldn't keep putting it off, that the truth was going to come out one way or another. But I could tell she was hoping for some kind of escape, a way out that didn't involve confronting the reality that lay between us. We left the cabin and walked along the same path as yesterday, the morning mist clinging to the trees. The air was crisp, and for a few moments, we walked in silence, letting the sounds of nature fill the space between us. "Mark," she finally began, her voice soft, hesitant. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About trust." I looked at her, waiting, letting her find the words on her own. She glanced at me, then looked away, her gaze distant as though trying to piece together a story that would make sense. Her fingers twisted around each other, betraying her nerves. "You know I love you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I don't want to hurt you." "Then don't," I replied, my tone calm, almost gentle. I could feel her edging toward the truth, hovering on the precipice. "Just be honest with me, Lucy. That's all I've ever asked." She stopped walking, turning to face me. For a moment, there was a flash of anger in her eyes, as though she resented me for forcing this out of her. But it faded quickly, replaced by something like resignation. Mark, she said, her voice shaking, I never meant for any of this to happen. I swear, I didn't. I didn't respond, just waited. She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the ground. There's someone I met, she admitted, her voice almost inaudible. It started as a friendship, I swear. But then, things got complicated. Complicated? I repeated, my voice tight. Lucy, what does that mean? She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to mine, then away again. I mean, we got close. Closer than I should have let it get. Her voice broke, and she looked at me, pleading. It was a mistake, Mark. I never wanted it to go this far. I could feel the cold knot in my stomach tightening, but I kept my expression unreadable. How long? I asked, my voice calm, though every muscle in my body was tense. Not long, she lied, and I could tell. She was scrambling, trying to control the damage. It happened a few times. I was lonely, Mark. You've been so busy, so distant. She trailed off, her voice catching. I could feel her trying to shift the blame, just a little, enough to justify her actions. But I wasn't buying it. So it's my fault? I asked, my voice hard. I was the one who made you cheat. No, she exclaimed, her voice trembling. No, that's not what I mean. I thought maybe I needed something different, something new. I felt stifled. Stifled? I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucy, I've done everything to make you happy. Supported you, gave you space. I trusted you. My voice cracked, despite my efforts to keep it steady. And this is what you do with that trust? She looked away, her face twisted with guilt and shame, but also with a trace of defiance, as though she still believed she had a right to her actions. And maybe, in some twisted way, she did. But it didn't make it hurt any less. Who is he? I asked, the question hanging heavily in the air. It doesn't matter, she whispered, shaking her head. It's over. It's done. Who is he? I repeated, my voice firmer. I deserve to know. Her face paled, and she bit her lip, hesitating. Just, someone from the gym. It was just, stupid. I was lonely, Mark. Lonely? I almost laughed, the sound bitter. Lucy, I was right here. I was always right here. She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, might try to justify herself. But she stayed silent, her head bowed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her choices. I turned away, unable to look at her, unable to bear the sight of the woman I had loved, the woman who had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. The silence between us was filled with 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 shattered dreams. Mark, she finally whispered, her voice thick with tears, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I didn't want to hurt you. Then why did you? I asked, my voice raw, my hands clenched at my sides. Why wasn't I enough? She didn't answer, and maybe she couldn't. Maybe there was no answer that could make sense of it all. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Mark, please, can we start over? Can we fix this? I turned to her, my eyes cold, all the warmth I'd once felt for her drained away. No, Lucy. I don't think we can. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. I could see it in her eyes, the way she staggered back, as though my words had struck her. For the first time, she seemed to understand what she had done, the reality of what she had lost. She took a step toward me, reaching out, her eyes pleading. Please, Mark. I'll do anything. Just, please, don't leave me. I pulled away, her touch like ice against my skin. I don't think you get to ask for anything anymore. Her face crumpled, and the tears she'd been holding back spilled over, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with it. For a long moment, we stood there, the silence between us broken only by her quiet, broken sobs. And in that silence, something inside me hardened. I knew I was done. I had loved her, given her everything I had, and in return, she had taken my trust and shattered it. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, resolute. "I'll pack my things when we get back. You can have the cabin to yourself." She looked up, her face a mask of desperation and regret. "Mark, please. I'll do anything. Just, give me one more chance." But I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. "You don't get any more chances, Lucy. Not from me." Her face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, sobbing, pleading. But her words meant nothing to me now. They were hollow, empty, the echoes of a love that had died the moment she chose to betray it. I left her there, alone in the clearing, her sobs fading into the distance as I walked away. The drive back from the cabin was a silent one. Lucy sat beside me, her gaze fixed out the window, her face pale and hollow, cheeks stained from the tears she'd shed earlier. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to feel pity for her, but I couldn't. She had destroyed us, and no amount of pleading or tears could bring back what we once had. When we finally pulled up in front of our house, she turned to me, her face twisted with a mix of regret and desperation. "Mark, please, can't we just talk about this?" I didn't answer, stepping out of the car and grabbing my bag from the back seat. I was too drained to fight, too hollowed out to argue. All I wanted was to be alone, to put as much distance between us as possible. Inside, I went straight to the bedroom and started packing a few things. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, the hesitant shuffle of someone who knew they weren't welcome but was desperate to be near. She lingered in the doorway, her voice small and trembling. "Where are you going to stay?" "Somewhere else," I replied flatly, not looking at her. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing the anger, the betrayal, or the sadness in my eyes. "Mark, please. Just, let me explain." I finally looked at her, my voice cold. "You already explained, Lucy. You were lonely, remember? And I was right here the whole time." My voice broke, despite my best efforts, and I turned away, shoving clothes into my bag with shaky hands. "Mark," she stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch me but then letting her hand fall. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "You could have just told me how you felt. You could have talked to me. But instead, you chose this." She broke down again, her shoulders slumping as she covered her face with her hands, her sobs echoing through the quiet room. I couldn't bear to watch her any longer, so I grabbed my bag, pushing past her and heading for the door. "Mark, please." She followed me into the hallway, her footsteps desperate, her voice frantic. "I'll do anything. Just, please, stay. Don't leave like this." I stopped, gripping the doorframe, taking a deep breath. My heart felt like it was being crushed in my chest, a heavy ache that left me gasping for air. I wanted to say something, anything that would ease the pain, but there was nothing. All the words, all the promises we'd made over the years, now felt meaningless, lost in the wreckage of our broken trust. "Goodbye, Lucy," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Then I walked out, closing the door behind me. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed at a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place you could pay in cash without questions. I didn't answer her calls, didn't respond to her texts. The silence helped, allowing me to sort through the shattered pieces of my life without her voice clouding my mind. One night, a few days later, I was sitting alone in my room, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to imagine a life beyond the hurt, beyond the betrayal. I was mentally listing out things I would have to do: find a lawyer, file for divorce, maybe even move away, when my phone buzzed on the bedside table. Another text from Lucy. This one was different from the others. Just a few words, but they cut through the silence, unraveling the wall I had built around myself. I know you hate me, Mark. I can't live with what I've done to you. I'm sorry. Goodbye. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, not quite understanding. The words felt final, desperate, and something inside me twisted painfully. My hands started to shake as the realization sank in. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, my heart racing as I sped back toward the house, praying that I wasn't too late. The streets were dark and empty, the shadows looming as I tore through them, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with images of Lucy, of her broken face, her voice trembling with apologies. When I finally pulled up in front of the house, I jumped out of the car and ran to the door, fumbling with my keys. The house was dark, eerily silent, and as I stepped inside, a cold chill ran down my spine. Lucy. I called out, my voice echoing in the empty rooms. There was no response. I searched every room, my heart pounding louder with each empty space. The bedroom was the last place I looked. I pushed the door open, and there she was, lying on the bed, her face pale and still, an empty bottle of pills on the nightstand beside her. Lucy! I shouted, rushing to her side, my hands shaking as I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. Lucy, wake up. Please. Don't do this. Don't leave me. But she didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, barely a whisper, and her skin was cold to the touch. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, praying that there was still time. Please, hurry, I choked out, barely able to get the words past the lump in my throat. It's my wife, she's not responding. The minutes that followed were a blur. Paramedics arrived, their faces grim as they worked to revive her. I stood back, my heart pounding, feeling as though I were trapped in a nightmare, watching my world slip away in slow motion. They finally stabilized her, and I followed them to the hospital, my mind numb, my heart aching with 1,000 regrets. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the walls, praying for a miracle. Hours later, a doctor finally approached me, his face somber. She's stable, he said quietly. But it was close. She's lucky you found her when you did. I nodded, relief flooding through me, but it was tinged with a deep, aching sadness. Lucy had tried to leave me in the most final way possible, and though she was still here, I knew things would never be the same. They let me see her, and as I entered her hospital room, my heart felt heavy with an unbearable weight. She was awake, her eyes red and swollen, her face etched with shame. She looked away as I approached, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Mark, she murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. I couldn't live with what I did to you. I wanted to be angry, wanted to tell her that this was her own doing, that she had brought this on herself. But standing there, seeing her so broken, so defeated, I couldn't bring myself to say it. I sat down beside her, reaching out to take her hand. She flinched but didn't pull away, and for a long moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything we'd lost hanging between us. Lucy, I said finally, my voice soft, I don't know if I can forgive you. But I'm here. For now. She nodded, her fingers gripping mine tightly, as though holding on to the last bit of hope she had left. Days turned into weeks, and though she recovered physically, there was a sadness in her eyes that never left. We lived like strangers in the same house, our conversations hollow, our laughter long gone. The love we once shared was a ghost, haunting the empty spaces of our lives. Eventually, I moved out, the silence of our broken home too much to bear. We didn't fight, didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Years later, I still think about her, about the life we had and the love we lost. Some nights, I wonder if I could have done things differently, if I could have saved us. But the truth is, we were already broken, long before that final night. Love, once lost, can't always be found again. Sometimes, all we're left with are memories, shadows of what might have been. And though the pain has faded, there are nights when I still dream of her, lying on that bed, her hand reaching out for me. But in those dreams, I never reach back. I just watch her fade away, a part of me slipping into the darkness with her.